Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Global Geopolitics. Tuesday, August 11. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Let me begin with a puzzle, one hiding in plain sight across the day's headlines. A senior Iranian official announces that the Strait of Hormuz, the artery through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil passes, remains closed, and that reopening it now comes with a list of conditions, compensation for war damages, and more besides. Meanwhile, the American vice president declares Iran's nuclear program destroyed and its military degraded. And here is the thing a casual reader might miss. Both of these statements can be simultaneously true, and that is precisely the problem. A power can be militarily broken and yet still hold the world's economy by the throat. The instrument of Iranian leverage is no longer a functioning air force or an intact nuclear enrichment cascade. It is a choke point. It is the mere ability to make a waterway unusable through mines, through uncertainty, through the insurance premiums that spike the moment a tanker captain hesitates. This is the state of the field, and it is the thread I want to pull on across our time together. We have entered an era in which the decisive form of power is not the capacity to build, but the capacity to deny. Not conquest, but obstruction. Not victory, but the withholding of normalcy. Consider how the Iranian president frames his own predicament, neither war nor peace. That phrase deserves to be sat with, because it is fast becoming the default condition of the international system rather than an exception to it. For most of the 20th century, our vocabulary assumed a binary. There was war, with its declarations and its treaties, and there was peace, with its commerce and its embassies. The category that now dominates, the gray, viscous middle, has no clean name because it was supposed to be a transition, not a destination. Yet look around. Ukraine is not offered peace. It is offered a winter with, in its president's own grim accounting, virtually no working thermal power plants after Russian strikes. That is not a battle for territory in the old sense. It is the deliberate engineering of a season of cold and darkness, an attack on the very possibility of ordinary life. The target is not the army. The target is the thermostat. Notice how the logic repeats. In the occupied West Bank, we hear of land expropriations dressed in the language of archaeology, of settler attacks that grind daily against the possibility of Palestinians simply remaining on their land. That, too, is a politics of denial of continuity, of presence, of the mundane right to stay put. And in the South China Sea, a nature reserve is declared, and the United States reads it not as conservation, but as a mechanism to deny Filipino fishing vessels access to their own grounds. A wildlife sanctuary as an instrument of maritime control. The bureaucratic paperwork of ecology repurposed into a wall. Once you have the pattern in your ear, you hear it everywhere. And here is the second, subtler layer. The tools of denial are increasingly things that were never meant to be weapons at all. A shipping lane, an archaeological dig, a conservation designation, a border checkpoint, as when Spain and Italy, two partners inside the same union, begin checking each other's travelers over a dispute about 70,000 migrants. These are the ordinary furniture of a functioning, interconnected world, and they are being flipped, one by one, into levers of coercion. Interdependence, which the optimists of a generation ago assured us would make us all too entangled to fight, has instead handed everyone a set of valves to close. Which brings me to the alliances, because power abhors this kind of exposure. When Saudi Arabia signs a defense pact with Pakistan and Turkey, a pact, we are carefully told, that names no adversary and is not aimed at Iran, the very insistence on what it is not tells you what it is. States that once outsourced their security to a single distant guarantor are now hedging, assembling their own shields, quietly acknowledging that the old umbrella may not open when the rain comes. This is not the birth of a tidy new bloc. It is the fraying of certainty, the scramble for insurance in a world where the guarantees feel provisional. So the field, as I read it, stands here. The grey zone has become the main event, denial has eclipsed conquest as the coin of the realm, and the everyday connective tissue of civilization is being militarized, valve by valve. Over our next two conversations, I want to test this. First, whether this state of neither war nor peace is stable or merely a slow fuse, whether a chokepoint economy can hold, or whether it eventually forces the very war it substitutes for. And second, what it asks of the rest of us who are not statesmen, but who live downstream of every closed strait and darkened grid. Because if power is now the power to deny, then resilience, the stubborn capacity to keep the lights on and the ships moving, becomes the quiet counter-strategy of our age. Let us begin there. If you were to lay these dispatches out on a table and squint at them, you might see only a scattering of unrelated calamities. A typhoon in eastern China, wildfires from Utah to British Columbia, to Lake Garda to the forests of France. A strait in the Persian Gulf held closed and reopened by degrees, subject to conditions and counterconditions. A defense pact signed in Mecca between three states, who insist, with a curious insistence, that it is aimed at no one in particular. Border checks reimposed between two members of the same union over the movement of some 70,000 people. And beneath all of it, Ukraine bracing for a winter with almost no thermal power left to warm it. Noise, one might say, the daily churn of a busy world. But I want to suggest that there is a deep current running under these waters, and once you feel its pull, the surface chop begins to make a different kind of sense. The current is this. The systems we built to guarantee flow are being quietly reorganized around the assumption of blockage. For roughly 3 decades, the governing fantasy of the international order was frictionlessness. Goods would move, energy would move, people would move, capital would move, and the moving itself would knit the world so tightly together that severing it would be unthinkable. Interdependence was not merely an economic condition. It was meant to be a peace policy. The more entangled we became, the less any of us could afford to pull a thread. Look now at what the thread pulling looks like in practice. A strait, the single most important artery for the world's seaborne oil, is not simply open or closed. It has become a negotiated variable. One party sets a list of demands: compensation for war damage, broader conditions, other conditions still unnamed. Another party seeks commitments that the attacks on shipping will end. A third, a patient intermediary, reports that talks are approaching their final stages, while carefully promising nothing. What has happened here is that the passage of the world's energy has been converted from a fact of geography into a lever of policy. The strait is no longer infrastructure. It is a bargaining chip. And once something becomes a bargaining chip, you can never fully trust it to simply function again. That is the deep current, the transformation of connective tissue into contested terrain. Notice how it repeats across domains that seem to have nothing to do with one another. The pact signed in the Arabian Peninsula, binding together a Gulf monarchy, a South Asian nuclear power, and a bridge between continents, is at bottom a hedge against the reliability of a single distant guarantor. States that spent decades outsourcing their security to one great patron are now assembling their own arrangements, precisely because the flow of protection can no longer be assumed. Whether it names an adversary or not is beside the point. The signing itself is a confession. The old plumbing is no longer trusted to deliver. And consider the two European neighbors slapping temporary checks on one another over the passage of people. Here is a union whose founding miracle was the abolition of exactly such checks. The border rendered invisible, the movement rendered ordinary. When one member reimposes controls and the other retaliates in kind, we are watching interdependence being manually throttled by the very hands that once built it. The reflex under pressure is not to deepen the connection. It is to install a valve. Even the fires belong to this story, though they arrive without a diplomat attached. A warming climate is, if you like, the ultimate disruptor of assumed flows, the flow of predictable weather, of habitable seasons, of harvests. When 100,000 people are relocated ahead of a storm, when governments in France go hunting for someone to blame for the unprecedented, they are confronting the same underlying condition. The background stability that everything else was built upon can no longer be taken as given. The reserve of predictability is drawing down, and nations under environmental stress do not, as a rule, become more generous with their borders or their bargaining. They become more protective of what remains. So here is the argument I would ask you to hold. We are not living through a series of unrelated crises. We are living through the phased transition of a single system, from an order organized around the promise of flow to an order organized around the management of chokepoints. Straits, borders, alliances, supply lines, even the weather itself, each is being reconsidered not as something we can rely upon, but as something we must negotiate, hedge, or defend. The peace that interdependence was meant to deliver rested on a wager that no one would ever want the leverage that a blockage confers. That wager is being called, and what we are watching, dispatch by dispatch, is a world quietly learning to live with the valve in its hand, and with the knowledge that everyone else has one too. So we come to the part of the conversation I always find the most difficult and the most rewarding, not what happened, but what it portends. The news of a given weekend is a scatter of pebbles thrown onto a table. The trick is not to catalogue each pebble, but to notice the shape they collectively suggest, and then to ask quietly, what breaks next? Consider the Strait of Hormuz, which has moved this week from being a geographic feature to being a piece of leverage with a price tag. When a state closes a waterway through which a fifth of the world's oil passes, and then, crucially, issues a list of demands for reopening it, compensation for war damages, conditions upon conditions, it has done something more consequential than block ships. It has established that access to the global commons is now negotiable, item by item. That is the second-order implication worth sitting with. The first-order story is a shipping disruption. The deeper story is the normalization of a bargaining posture in which the arteries of the world economy become chips in a poker game. Once that precedent is set, it does not unset itself. Every future crisis inherits the memory that a choke point can be monetized. Watch, then, not merely for whether a deal is struck, but for the shape of the deal, because the terms will become the template. And notice the accompanying phrase, that peculiar and honest formulation of being caught in a state of neither war nor peace. It is, I think, the defining condition of our moment, and not for one country alone. We increasingly inhabit a gray zone where hostilities never quite resolve into either open conflict or genuine settlement. The economic effect of this ambiguity is corrosive precisely because it resists pricing. Markets can absorb a war. They can flourish in a peace. What they cannot do is efficiently allocate capital across an indefinite maybe. So the thing to watch is not the dramatic breakthrough or the dramatic collapse, but the slow tax that permanent uncertainty levies on everyone standing near the fault line. Then there is a development that deserves far more attention than a single weekend affords it, the formation of a defense pact among three states that, we are repeatedly and rather insistently told, is aimed at no one in particular. When a security arrangement announces that it names no adversary, it is generally worth asking who is meant to feel named. The significance here is not the pact itself, but what it reveals, that regional powers are beginning to hedge against the reliability of their traditional patron. That is a structural signal. For decades, the architecture of that region rested on a single guarantor. When client states start building their own overlapping arrangements, nuclear-capable partners, cross-continental defense ties, they are quietly announcing that they no longer wish to bet everything on one guarantee. This is how alliance systems erode, not through betrayal, but through diversification. The thing to watch is whether this becomes a pattern in other theaters, because if hedging becomes fashionable, the whole notion of a single stabilizing power begins to dissolve, and with it, a certain predictability that, for all its faults, kept the peace expensive to break. Now, permit me a widening of the lens, because the corpus offers something the geopolitician too often ignores. Alongside the Strait and the Pacts, we have wildfires tearing across France, Italy, Canada, typhoons emptying coastlines of 100,000 souls, a warehouse of rotting food producing a stench that is, in its own small way, a parable. These are not distractions from the geopolitics. They are the geopolitics of the coming decades. Arriving early, the state that must simultaneously evacuate its coast before a storm and defend a contested reef is a state whose resources are being pulled in two directions at once. The second-order implication is that climate disruption and strategic competition will increasingly compete for the same finite bandwidth of governance. Watch for the moment when a country's capacity to project power abroad is visibly constrained by its need to protect itself at home. That is the pressure that reshapes ambitions. And do not overlook the smaller stories, because they are how the large ones announce themselves. Two neighbors within the same union imposing border checks on each other over migration. That is the sound of an integrated bloc discovering the limits of its own solidarity. A country facing a winter with virtually no functioning power plants. That is the weaponization of infrastructure, the recognition that you needn't conquer a nation if you can simply make it cold. Each of these is a rehearsal for a broader script. So what, in the end, does it mean? It means we are watching the quiet decommissioning of assumptions, that commons stay open, that guarantors stay reliable, that states may attend to one crisis at a time. None of these collapses announce themselves loudly. They arrive, as this weekend did, disguised as a scatter of unrelated headlines. The work, always, is to see the table beneath the pebbles. And that, I'm afraid, is where I must leave you, not with an answer, but with better questions to carry into the week ahead. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.